Githa, welcome, and we are so happy to see you here. I know you had a trying 24-hour period behind you, but I'm happy that you managed to join us today. Yes, Githa.
Thank you so much. I must, in the interests of accuracy, I must point out that it's not a trying 24 hours. It's close to a trying 100 hours. And
Oh dear.
ongoing. It's wonderful to be able to speak to somebody else since I can't leave the house. Anyway, I thank you. I have to say that so much praise is making me feel I will never recognize myself again. But I do want to pick up on something you spoke about, Manju, which is multiplicity, that the numbers. Um, eh, it's not the right time to wax lyrical. I think it's the time for writers, readers, students, teachers, all of us to um, use words, use words as what they are, which is that they are weapons full of meaning, full of riches. And this is how we look at the truth. This is how we search for the truth. So, what am I saying about multiplicity? Whether it is as a writer or as a citizen, I am talking about the importance of acknowledging and living diversity. Because the homogeneous story invariably leads to the exclusion of people. It invariably leads to censorship. It invariably leads to what the poet Seamus Heaney called the government of the tongue. And today, that is where we are in our country. So even though we might writers write about the stuff of daily life, we write about people and their lives and their fears and what they dream about, and both literally and metaphorically. But the ideas there, the worldview that you are searching for through your books, through the questions your books pose, is a complex, diverse. So this is the narrative I want to talk about, and I'm glad you said that we all have multiple identities. We do, but all of us have to remember that we are living through times when the danger of a single story, whether it is what this completely bewildering, rich, variegated country can be reduced to if you want to exclude people, if you want to exclude ideas, if you want to sully the freedom of speech and the freedom to dissent. I think I'll begin there and wait for your specific questions.
I agree with you, Gita. A writer always has a dream. A writer is something of an idealist. And well, there are goals that we strive towards, but then there are always hindrances in our path. Let me focus on your work and ask you, Gita, if you can tell us about the major milestones in your life which shaped you as a writer, which influenced you. So let's come back to the personal.
I know it's very difficult for writers to emphasize the fact that it is the work. And I have never been the kind of writer who is terribly enthusiastic about, sharing details of my life, because I don't know what great value there is there. But I grew up knowing I would always do something with words. My father was a journalist. He was the founder editor of the Economic Times. And I knew that I would do something with words. Of course, it's too ignorant to know what I would do with them. And like many young people did in our generation, as a young college student, I wrote what I imagined was poetry. I'm quite sure my poet friends will have a bit of a laugh at that. And Nissim Ezekiel, who was a friend when I was a very young woman, I he wasn't a friend to begin with. I just went there and gave him, with all the confidence you have as a young person, some of what I thought was poetry, and asked him to read them. And he said very kindly, "This is what is called juvenilia." And then he said, "Do you know what the word means?" Of course, I was quite annoyed then, but he was wonderful because he read all my first book review, my first short story, and he would send me these little yellow postcards saying, "Persist, persist," and that's really what I did. There's some people in the present who are very lucky; they seem to be able to write when they're disgracefully young and get published when they're even more disgracefully young. But we were slow. I was slow. I did a lot of apprentice work, which I didn't impose on the world. It was also what happened to women of middle-class women of my generation. If you were not doing the things your family and your beloved parents expected you to do, then you had to support yourself. You could hardly ask them to underwrite your rebellion. So I needed a job. And then later, when I had my children, I needed to earn so I could pay their school fees and so on. So it was even more postponed, let me say, the writing. So I'm just trying to say that it was a very long period of apprenticeship. And in fact, the women in the audio, among our viewers will be happy to hear that it was when I went away on maternity leave the first time. And it was so terribly boring that I began writing The Thousand Faces of Night, and then became an out of the closet writer. So I think the only other literary milestone I can talk of is, of course, reading and writing are like inhaling and exhaling. So a lifetime of reading. And that's important because when you're writing, who are you writing to? You're writing to many of the writers you admire. And imagine them as your readers, even if you've never set eyes on them, even if they're long dead. So that is there. But I think I began with 3 novels which looked at the power of story and the power of storytelling. And what does the tale do? When I tell you a story and you pass it on, what happens? How does the story change, mutate? How does it change you, and so on? Then I think when I began writing in times of siege, actually finally became bolder. I think I left, I decided that I would look at the very dubious magic of day-to-day life, of political life. It's not that my earlier novels were not political, because they were looking at structures of power, but in a covert, elliptical way. But from In Times of Siege, and the attack on history, the attack on independent thought, the attack on the university space, I really began writing what I think of as the collective autobiography, the story of our present lives. So that was In Times of Siege, and then Fugitive Histories, which has at its heart what happened in Gujarat in 2002. You understand that it's not about these, but Fugitive Histories, for example, so many of us who are either not Muslim or who do not live in Gujarat, why is it that we were so shattered? Why is it we were involved? Why did we feel solidarity then? And we continue to for a number of events and causes today. And I have a couplet that repeats itself through the novel. How did other people's stories get into my head? How did other people's stories become mine? And I think that is a writerly way of saying that it's solidarity that connects us to each other, that rules us. Because, if you are going to live only with your own kind, life is not worth living. So that is what Fugitive Histories was. And I have become the tide, which is sort of, the third in that trilogy. It really, I think anybody who reads it, either the novel or anybody who reads the news today, the independent media's news will know that it is talking to our time, talking to the old fault lines, the horrors of caste, but also the new manifestations as well as the suppression of dissent.
Yes, you are very right, Gita. Talking about your in times of siege, was that the time when you broke your leg and you decided to bring in your experience of the broken leg into the book? When you talked about all the scratches that you had because your leg felt itchy?
You know, you never know yourself what little autobiographical details go into it. Yes, when it comes to breaking bones, I am a rather experienced person. I have to say that when I went to the US for the release of Almost Home, I broke both legs then. So that was even better than in times of siege.
Maybe for those who are listening and who do not know what we are talking about, there are a couple of pages on different scratches. You know, when you break your leg, then you have your leg in plaster, and then as the leg is healing, then the leg starts feeling itchy. So you need to scratch it. But then what do you scratch it with? Because it's all covered, the leg is covered in plaster. So in that book, there is a girl who has a leg in plaster, and she looks for different scratchers with which to scratch her leg. So there is a ruler, there is a pencil, there is a feather with a long stem at the end, there is a stick, and there are all sorts of things with which the protagonist scratches her leg, her injured.
Manju, I must add that when you say the girl, she's quite what shall I say, a storehouse of power, and
Yes,
might have a broken leg and might be tortured with wanting to scratch it. But she also wants to leave her mark, if I can carry the image forward, on what is happening to her guardian, who is being victimized for a history lesson he's written.
That's right.
So she's talking about, she's actually implicitly leading us to ask questions about what should a university space be like? What is it there for?
The students' union that she's heading and the students that she gets together, so that the professor, who is her guardian, doesn't have to face any unpleasant situations. I remember that, yes. But I find,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's not just politics in the narrow sense of a union and so on. Those are just useful little structures. She's actually asking a much bigger question, which you and I would be interested in, which is that if you are in a space of learning, and this is important to us because when we're reading or writing, we're also in a space of learning, like we are in our own private universities. But in a university, what are you there for? You are there to speculate, to imagine and debate. Because if you don't have doubt and difference and discussion in a university, no learning is happening because it's all been written and all you have to do is memorize it by rote. Because there's some, god of information who's feeding you. So I think that's the real itch in the novel.
Yes, Gita, and I find that there is a similarity in your concerns right from that book coming down to the present one, that I have become the tide. But when you look back at your earliest work, say when you look back to 1,000 Faces of the Night, what do you think of the book now? Would you have written it in a different way if you had to write it now?
Of course, the only constant, they say, the cliche goes, is change. Of course, I mean, that's like something my younger sister wrote. But, a younger sister I feel quite kindly towards, not terribly embarrassed by her. But The 1,000 Faces of Night, for many of us, and certainly for me, the entry point into looking at structures of power, what in our days we used to call being politicized, was through the women's movement. So I think very early we realized that our brothers or male cousins or men at large were expected to do much less than us, whether it was at home, and we had many more rules, you know. So then, as I said, I began writing The Thousand Faces of Night when I was on maternity leave, and I was surrounded by these women, you know, all giving me wonderful contradictory advice about what I should do with the baby and, you know, feeding and this and that. And they were also talking to each other freely. It was a kind of amazing, powerful women's version of locker room conversation. Except this locker room conversation was not objectifying anybody else. They were actually talking about the intimate connection between themselves, as you know, their identity and their bodies, for example, because there's nothing other than, you know, childbearing, which makes you identify with your body, whether you like it or not. Now, at that point, you realized what a range of women's stories of oppression, but also subversion there was. There was always the story of resistance as well. And there was so much reference to the myths that this actually gave me a kind of voice that let's look at the prescriptive myths, the tales in the myths, and what were the subversive ones? You know, the women who, whether it was Amba or Surpanaka, or, you know, who expressed themselves, who even changed sex and aspire to a certain kind of power and so on. So that's how The Thousand Faces of Night. I must add, though, Manju, in all honesty, that writers don't work it out like this, like a seminar. You write.
It flows like a river.
Your early work is spontaneous, and later, as you're thinking about it, as you're thinking of your writer's agenda for the rest of your life, you know, you come up with it. And it's mostly when other people ask. And if you can't be a real writer if you can't make up a good answer.
You're right, Githa. When I read your novels, I find that it has a certain impact on me. It is a very calming impact, and they go very slowly. You have to take each line, you know, you have to take your time with each line, and you can't do it in a hurry. You have to enjoy, you have to savor every word, every line. And then what hits you is what Wordsworth has called the still sad music of humanity. The still sad music of humanity. And sometimes I find myself wondering, is Gita inspired by the other side of life, you know, the carnivalesque, the riotous, the joyous, the happy face of life? What do you say to that, Gita?
Well, I think there is a lot of play in the language. I think there's a little bit of fun, as all serious things must have some fun. But, you know, I don't, I mean, Wordsworth and so on, I find a bit depressing to think in terms of my school days or something. And it sort of brings to mind very boring classes where they would go on about lyrical ballads. I'm so sorry. I hope I'm not corrupting your students. Really what I want readers, if I could ask them to take away something from the work, is to share with me the questions I have that have led me to write that. I haven't written any of it because I have the answers. If I had the answers, I would demand to be on what we used to call the Planning Commission, and it's now some other sort of body. But so I want my readers, I want younger people. There are always younger people in my books because it's their future we are looking at. You know, I'm old, perhaps not you, but so so I want them to share those questions and look at the possibilities I suggest, and as they read, they will consider some possibilities. So I've always said that if there is one quick and pithy and efficient way I can describe my work and my writing life, it's a punctuation mark. It's the question mark. And that is what I want to work at. That is all I'm equipped to do. That is what the reader should do. That is what students should do. And more than ever, in these times when dissent is being crushed, that is what all our fellow citizens inspire us to do. From our farmers to our old grandmothers to our students.
With that, Githa, should we come to the latest book that you brought out? I Have Become the Tide. Would you like to tell us about it?
Well, you know what I'm going to do. I don't know how much time we have, Manju.
We have about 15 minutes more.
Yeah, because for reasons, if you look up the news, I am rather tired. It's been, in fact, in 15 minutes, it'll be exactly 100 hours. What I want to do is quickly say that I Have Become the Tide has three, again, multiplicitous, interwoven narratives. One is talking about somewhere around anything between 9th to 12th centuries, the son of a cattle skinner who finds a movement which wants to bring people together regardless of gender, caste, and so on. And as we know, our history is full of those movements which died out, but they were there and they will always be there to inspire us, the various bhakti movements, for example. So that story is interwoven with the present and how many things we now have a constitution that guarantees us equality. We now have laws which say caste inequality, caste discrimination, caste atrocity is against the law. But how much has changed? You only have to look about you to read new horrors. So that is two, and I have three young students who are students. So that much has changed. But what is not? Does the institution accept them? Does society accept them? So I have three students who are trying to get into medical college. Only one of them does. And then what happens to him there? So in between, to bridge these is because how do I put myself? I can't, as a writer, I can't only be writing about myself. I can't write only about this little world from which I come. Of a certain caste and class of power. But that's what being a writer means. I have to try and understand. I have to express solidarity, the word I began with. So that is the story. But usually I love to read something from the poet, the Dalit poet from all those centuries back. But today, there is no time to go back to the past. Today, we should remain in the present. So I am going to, if I may, read only read a couple of paragraphs from the very last chapter for an important reason. Because while we are submerged in division, in hate-mongering, in misery, in poverty, discrimination, we have love, we have play, we have language, we have literature, the arts, music, but we also have wonderful stories of resistance personified in those who resist, which is why I want to read not from the problems, but from resistance. The people ahead are moving. The rally has begun. The banners have been stretched out. The placards go up, high enough to be seen and read. And the slogans, how many there are, how they mingle words and languages. Then a long one-voiced call fills the air. The reply is many-voiced. It's like a song Satya's mother and her friends may have once sung in the fields. The rally is moving slowly. People are crying themselves hoarse. They fill up the road. From where Asha walks, she can hear one wave shouting, Lal Salam. The wave that meets this one roars, Jai Bhim. Asha walks between the waves as if her thin, dark body, her voice can make a bridge. Every time she responds to a slogan, Asha feels her chest tighten. She means what she says. She means it so much, she has to shout it out. The people's voice, Senthil called it. Senthil's voice, Ravi's drum that beats like a powerful heart. The voice Asha hears coming out of her mouth. Together, they may make up a song with many verses, with or without rhyme. And the refrain. It must boom its way into the air, into Ravi's airless home and Satya's mother's lost field and Asha's father's government office. It must roll like a tsunami, find its way into the classroom and court and parliament and Satya's grave. The refrain is the one part of the song that must be sung together. The sun shines so hard, it could be the most powerful slogan shouter in the crowd. The road ahead of them is lustrous as water. The sweat pours down Asha's back. Her kurta is stuck to her skin. Ravi's face is wet, but he's hammering his drum, stopping only to wipe the sweat off his hands. Then an unexpected breeze arrives, turns into wind. It amplifies the people's slogans. The wind blows, teaching everything, every scrap of junk, every person there, what it is to move. To refuse to stay in the same old tight-fitting place. The slogans get louder and the drums beat harder. In this blur of faces, words, and voices, Asha can almost believe that this crowd is not alone. There are other crowds in places across the country. There's strong currents flowing down roads and fields, through villages and towns and cities. The crowd mills around Ravi and Asha. Ravi's drum has finally gone silent. She takes Ravi's hand. The red and blue flags, the words, the voices, the people. Is it only today? Or has this river of living bodies been flowing for 1,000 years? The river rises. It fills Asha with anger and grief, but also a strange joy. She can hear Satya tell her, or maybe it's she who's telling Satya and Ravi, even the dead Professor Krishna and Chikaya. I have become the tide. Thank you so much, and I invite all of you to join me, to teach me how to become the tide. I have to leave now. Thank you.
Thank you, Githa. She's left.